First, a little bit of background, just to give us some context on where we've been versus where we are now within epistemology. See, over time, epistemology has kind of expanded and become much more diverse and rich, which is really cool. There are innumerable theories, practically innumerable theories, on knowledge and on specific components of knowledge, which we'll get into very shortly. But that wasn't always the case, and I'd like to begin by emphasizing that epistemology has not always been as, not as exciting, at least if, like me, you find it most exciting when there are many seats at the table, many different competing perspectives. At one time in philosophy's history, there were, broadly speaking, like two broad groups of people who kind of were duking it out over the course of a few centuries on this matter of knowledge, specifically on this matter of where knowledge comes from. And these two groups of people were known as the rationalists and the empiricists. And so in early modern history, in the early modern period of philosophy's history, you had rationalists like René Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, who held that all of our knowledge comes from reason. So whatever we know is just that stuff that we can reasonably arrive at. We can arrive at using our minds, our reasoning capacities of our minds specifically. On the other side, you had these empiricists. And as the name might suggest, they held that all of our knowledge comes from experience, the empirical. Examples of empiricist philosophers were David Hume, George Berkeley, John Locke. Essentially, the rationalist-empiricist debate was a debate over where knowledge comes from. And it lasted a few hundred years, beginning with Descartes. Traditionally, it's held to have kind of come to some kind of close with Immanuel Kant in the late 18th century. And this took place when he conceived of something called transcendental idealism. Transcendental idealism maintains that some of our knowledge comes from experience, and some of our knowledge comes from reason. So you can see how this was an attempt on Kant's part to reconcile the two schools of thought. And of course, whether or not he was successful in doing so is still a matter of debate. At the very least, it doesn't seem like he solved all the problems of epistemology, because if that were true, this video wouldn't exist, and we wouldn't still be talking about it. Quite the opposite, actually. As I said just momentarily ago, epistemology has kind of expanded quite drastically beyond the rationalist-empiricist divide. As I mentioned before, this is essentially a debate over where knowledge comes from. And one of the things that is different about epistemological debates today is that philosophers recognize that this is not the only question we need to ask. There are certain components of this thing called knowledge, each of which need to be explicated at this point.